Amber Hollow had been dead for 41 years when Elias Vane came to claim it. The lawyer called it an inheritance. The county called it a liability. The 7 remaining ranchers who still grazed cattle on its outskirts called it a waste of good boot leather, and said so to his face at the feed store before he'd even unpacked his truck. "Your grandfather held on to that dirt out of spite," said one. Nothing there but a windmill and regret. Elias didn't answer. He had learned, over 30 years of not knowing his grandfather, that silence traveled further than argument. The town itself confirmed the warnings. 12 buildings, roofs caved or missing. A saloon sign rusted into unreadable script, a well gone dry sometime during the Coolidge administration by the look of the mineral rings. Elias walked the single street with his dog, a lean shepherd mix named Tally, and counted the buildings twice because the first count didn't feel real. 11 were open to the sky, the wood soft as bread. The 12th had a steel door, riveted, painted the color of dried blood, and a padlock the size of a fist. Tally would not go near it. She circled at 20 feet and sat, ears back, and would not be called closer. Elias stood in front of the door for a long time before he tried the lock, and longer after it wouldn't open. 11 miles east, on a slope the county maps still labeled Reyes grade, Adelia Reyes was having a different argument with the same drought. She'd spent 4 years terracing 2 acres of hillside that her neighbors agreed, without malice, was dead. Not poor soil, dead soil. Cracked into plates you could lift with 2 fingers, gone 8 years without a real rain. "You're burying good clay pots in a graveyard," Hollis Bragg told her, leaning on her fence rail like it belonged to him. Hollis ran cattle on 3,000 acres downstream and held water rights that predated the county itself. He was not unkind. He was simply certain. "Allahs hold water at the root," Dell said, not looking up from the trench she was digging. "Clay sweats slow. Roots follow sweat. Roots follow what's already dead," Hollis said, and left before she could answer, which was his particular skill. She buried the pot anyway. 41 down. 59 to go, by her grandfather's count, though her grandfather had never finished counting. Tomas Reyes had died with the terrace only quarter built, his journal open on the kitchen table to a page half written, the ink gone brown. Dell had read it so many times she could recite the marginal notes better than her own memory. Contour line every 3 feet of drop, all yaw spacing 6 feet. Berm height 8 inches minimum or the water walks around instead of down. She had followed his numbers exactly, and the numbers had failed her first season anyway. 11 miles west, Elias found the key. It was not in the house. It was not in the strong box the lawyer had shipped him, full of deeds and a photograph of a man he didn't recognize as kin until he saw his own jaw in it. It was taped beneath the false bottom of a tin document box, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the damp out for 4 decades, next to a notebook with a cracked leather spine. The Vane ledger, the first page read, in a hand gone shaky toward the end. Elias read it standing up, then sitting down, then a third time by lamplight because the numbers demanded it. Cistern depth, 41 feet. Capacity at full seal, 62,000 gallons. Clay liner, 6 inches, tamped in 3-inch lifts, cured for weeks minimum before water. Valve set at 14 feet, below silt line, above the sediment trap. Do not open above ground level. The town does not need a well. The town needs to stop wasting what falls on it. The locked building was not a vault. It was a valve house, built over an underground cistern the size of a church basement, fed by a network of stone channels that ran beneath every street in Amber Hollow, funneling every drop of rain off every roof and every road toward one buried tank. His grandfather had built a town that caught its own water and never needed to dig for more. It had been locked, the ledger explained near its final pages, because the seal had cracked in a hard freeze the winter before he died, and he hadn't lived long enough to fix it. Rather it stay dry and closed than open and useless, he'd written. A cracked cistern that people trust is worse than a locked door. Elias looked at the steel door for a long time. Then he went and found a shovel. His first attempt at resealing the crack cost him 3 weeks and a great deal of pride. He mixed the clay by eye instead of by his grandfather's ratio, packed it in 2-inch lifts instead of 3, and cured it for 9 days instead of 28 because the county assessor had scheduled a visit and Elias, humiliatingly, wanted something to show him. The patch held for 6 days under test water. On the 7th, at 4 in the morning, Tally woke him with a bark he'd never heard her use, sharp and short, 3 times. The valve house floor was an inch deep in water that shouldn't have been there. He drained the tank by hand, bucket by bucket, cursing his own impatience with every trip, and reread the ledger by lantern light until he found the line he'd skimmed past the first time. Clay wants to be told what to do slowly. Rush the cure, and it forgets its shape the first time it's tested. Second attempt, 3-inch lifts, exactly, tamped with a hand tamper his grandfather had left hanging on a nail he hadn't noticed. 28 days of cure, which meant 28 days of the town's 7 ranchers driving past to look at the boy sitting outside a locked shed doing, as far as any of them could tell, nothing at all. Waiting on dirt to dry, one of them said at the feed store, and the laugh traveled. Dell's first attempt was a different kind of failure, but it stung the same. She'd buried the olives at 18 inches, per her grandfather's note, but her grandfather's note had been written for a slope with clay subsoil, and Reyes grade, she discovered too late, sat on decomposed granite that drained twice as fast. 18 inches put the pots below the root mass entirely. The water sweated out exactly as promised, into rock, past every root that needed it. Her first planting came up at 61%, then withered to 40 by August. Wick, her 12-year-old hired hand, and the only person in 3 counties who didn't think she was foolish, dug up one of the failed pots with her and watched her turn it over in her hands. "Grandpa's numbers don't work here," he said, not unkindly, just true. "Grandpa's numbers worked where he wrote them," Dell said. "This ground's not his ground." She reset the olives at 11 inches, angled the trench 2 degrees toward each plant instead of laying it flat, and rewrote the ratio in the journal's margin in her own hand, dated, so the next Reyes wouldn't repeat her mistake. The second planting came up at 88%. Hollis Bragg drove past both properties on his way to town most Tuesdays, and by early summer, he'd developed a habit of narrating what he saw to whoever would listen at the grain co-op. "Vane's got a hole in the ground, he waters like a garden and calls it engineering," he'd say. "Reyes has got half her hillside looking like a pincushion. Between the two of them, they'll drain the county dry, proving a point nobody asked them to make." He wasn't cruel about it. He was a man who trusted rivers and rain gauges and had buried a father who'd trusted a diviner's rod instead, and the difference between faith and evidence had cost his family a bad decade once already. He doubted Elias and Dell in exactly equal measure, and told each of them so, separately, with the same flat courtesy. They met for the first time in July, at the County Water Board's informal hearing. 3 folding tables in the Grange Hall, called because 7 ranchers and 1 skeptical cattleman had petitioned to have both projects reviewed before either did something to the water table. Dell arrived with her journal. Elias arrived with his ledger. Neither had expected the other. "You're the cistern," Dell said. "You're the pincushion hill," Elias said, and regretted it before he finished the sentence. "That's not what it's called. I heard it called worse on the drive over." She studied him for a moment, not unkindly, the way she studied ground before deciding whether it was worth breaking. 62,000 gallons sitting under one town. What happens when it's full and it keeps raining? It was a fair question. Elias didn't have the answer, and said so, which surprised her more than a lie would have. "What happens on your hill when it doesn't rain enough to reach the pots 11 inches down?" He asked back. Same problem, different direction. They didn't like each other, exactly. They recognized each other, which was worse, because it meant neither could dismiss the other's doubt as ignorance. Hollis watched the exchange from the back of the hall and said nothing, which for Hollis was itself a kind of verdict. August brought the dry that broke things loose in people's tempers. September brought the first real heat since anyone could remember, 96 degrees at elevation. The creek beds cracked white. Elias's cistern filled steadily under his repaired seal, 11,000 gallons by the first week of September, 19,000 by the third, every reading logged in a new ledger he'd started beside his grandfather's old one, in the same careful hand, dated and dry-stamped, so the ink wouldn't run if the shed ever flooded again. September 3 to 11,400 gallons. Seal dry. Valve holding at 14 feet. No seep above. September 14 to 19,800 gallons. Seal dry. Tally will not enter shed during rain. Investigate. September 21 to 24,100 gallons. Seal dry. Sky wrong today. Dell's second planting thrived through the heat, roots pulling steady from the olives, but her worry moved to a different register entirely. The terrace berms she'd built at 8 inches, exactly per her grandfather's number, were holding water beautifully in light rain and doing nothing at all against the kind of rain that didn't come gently. She hadn't seen that kind of rain yet. She had, however, seen the sky the third week of September, and she trusted her grandfather's other note more than she trusted the calm. Drought breaks hard here, not soft. Build for the flood, not the drizzle. Wick found her that evening building a second, taller berm above the first, a full foot, mud and packed hard, on ground she'd already finished. Thought we were done with this section, he said. We're never done, Dell said. We're just less wrong than we were. Hollis's cattle were the ones who told him first. 3 days later, moving uphill off the low pasture before dawn without being driven, the way stock does when the air changes pressure faster than a man can feel it. He checked the radio forecast at 5 in the morning and didn't like the word it used. Cell, not storm. Cell, the kind that sat and dumped instead of passing through. By 9, the sky over Amber Hollow had gone the color of a bruise healing. Elias saw it from the valve house door, where he'd taken to sitting most mornings now with his ledger and a mug of coffee, and Tally saw it a half-second before he did, standing stiff-legged, hackled, staring not at the sky, but at the ground, at the network of stone channels running beneath the street toward the cistern. She had never done that before. Elias had learned, by now, to trust it. 11 miles east, Dell stood at the top of her terraces with Wick and watched the same bruise-colored cell sit directly over the ridge that separated her land from Amber Hollow, and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has read her grandfather's warnings twice too often to ignore them, that it was not going to pass through gently. Get the horse up top, she told Wick. Moss doesn't like standing water. If he won't cross the lower field, don't make him. The rain started at 11, and within 40 minutes it had stopped being rain in any ordinary sense and become something closer to a wall. 3 inches in 90 minutes. By the gauge Hollis checked and rechecked with the flat disbelief of a man watching a number lie to him. The dry creek beds filled, then overfilled, then began doing what dry ground does when 4 seasons of drought have baked it into something closer to stone than soil. It refused the water outright and sent it downhill instead, gathering speed, gathering mud, gathering everything loose it passed. The flood came down off Reyes Grade first, because Reyes Grade sat highest. Dell's original berms, the 8-inch ones, took the first surge and held for 11 minutes before the water simply walked over the top of them, exactly as Tomas Reyes's journal had warned it would if she ever underbuilt for a hard break. She watched it happen from 50 yards up the slope, helpless, and felt something in her chest go cold and clear at once. But the second berm, the foot-high one she'd built 3 days earlier on instinct and a dead man's marginal note, caught what the first one couldn't hold, slowed it, spread it wide instead of letting it channel and gain speed. The olives beneath, buried 11 inches down exactly where the second planting's roots had found them, did something no one had asked them to do. They drank. Slowly, stupidly, gallon by gallon. The buried clay took in water it had no immediate use for and simply held it, taking mass and speed both out of the surge as it passed. It wasn't enough to stop the flood. It was enough to slow it. And slowed water, moving downhill toward Amber Hollow instead of galloping, was a different animal entirely. In town, the stone channels beneath the street were doing exactly what Josiah Vane had built them to do 4 decades earlier, gathering every roof, every gutter, every foot of the town's own runoff and funneling it, in a controlled sheet, toward the valve house. The cistern took the first surge without complaint. 24,000 gallons already banked, room for 38,000 more. Elias stood at the valve house with his hand on the wheel that controlled the intake gate, watching the gauge climb faster than he'd ever logged it. 31,000, 36, 41, and understood, with the same cold clarity Dell had felt 50 minutes earlier and 11 miles away, that his grandfather's number had a ceiling, and the ceiling was coming. 62,000 gallons of capacity. The cell wasn't slowing. If the water Dell's terraces weren't holding came down the last stretch at full, uneroded speed, the valve house intake, built for a controlled sheet, not a battering ram, would take a pressure it was never rated for. He didn't know that Dell's berms were holding 2 ridges away. He only knew what his own ledger told him, which was that he had perhaps 20 minutes before the tank either overflowed or the intake gate blew outward under a surge it couldn't process. He opened the spillway, a channel his grandfather had cut but never labeled clearly in the ledger except as the second mouth, for when the first is full, and watched 40,000 gallons of banked, calm water redirect itself out of the cistern's east wall, down a stone trough Elias hadn't fully understood the purpose of until that exact moment, and out toward the low pasture that bordered Hollis Bragg's land. Toward the exact low ground where Dell's slowed floodwater, robbed of speed by her terraces, was now arriving. The two flows met in the low pasture at 12:14 in the afternoon, the cistern's clean, controlled release meeting the terrace-slowed runoff instead of a raw flash flood, and where a wall of debris-choked water should have hit the pasture at full force and gouged it into a new creek bed by evening. Something else happened instead. The spillway's clean water arrived first, and soaked ground already primed to receive it. The terrace-slowed surge arrived seconds later, its speed already broken by 2 ridges of berms and 41 buried olives, and instead of compounding into something worse, the two flows simply spread. Wide, shallow, slow. The kind of water a fence line survives. The kind of water cattle can stand in without being swept off their feet. Hollis Bragg was standing at that exact fence line when it happened, having ridden down at a gallop the moment he saw the cell sitting over both properties, expecting to find wreckage on one side or the other, expecting to be right about at least one of them. Instead, he found calm water spreading across his low pasture at a depth his own boots could handle, and watched, genuinely watched, boots planted, hat forgotten in his hand, as it kept spreading instead of gouging. He walked the fence line for 11 minutes without saying a word to anyone, tracing where the two flows met, crouching once to press his palm flat against ground that should have been washing away beneath a flood of that size and wasn't. Then he did the only thing that mattered. He opened the gate on the last stretch of his own irrigation channel, the one that had sat closed for 2 dry years, and let the slowed water route through onto his own driest acreage instead of pooling uselessly against the fence. He didn't say he'd been wrong. Hollis Bragg had never once, in 40 years, said those words out loud. But he opened that gate with his own hands in front of both of them, and that was the only conversion the day required. The rain broke by 2 in the afternoon, sudden as it had come. By 4, the sky had gone the ordinary blue of a September that had simply had a hard day. Elias found Dell at the fence line where the two flows had met, both of them soaked, both of them checking ground instead of each other at first, him measuring how far the spillway water had traveled, her counting which berms had held and which hadn't. Tally sat near the fence post without circling it, without hesitation, tail down but easy, the way a dog sits when a threat has passed through and not stayed. Your ditch fed my flood, Dell said finally, not looking up from the mud. Your hill slowed it down enough to matter, Elias said. She straightened, wiped her hands on her jeans, looked at the wide shallow water still standing calm across the pasture instead of a gouged new creek bed. Didn't think your hole in the ground would be good for anything but sitting there, she said. Didn't think your pincushion hill would hold, he said. She almost smiled. He almost did too. We should talk before next season, she said. Compare numbers. Yeah, Elias said. We should. That was the whole of it. No speech. No apology dressed up as one. Just two people standing in ankle-deep water that hadn't destroyed anything, looking at ground that had, for one afternoon, worked exactly as two dead men had separately promised it would. By the following spring, the valve house door stood open during daylight, and Amber Hollow had 6 new residents drawn by nothing more than the rumor of a town that had survived a 100-year storm without losing a foundation. Reyes Grades Terraces climbed another 20 rows, its journal 3 hands deep in corrections now instead of 1. Hollis Bragg kept his gate open through the dry months that followed, which everyone understood, without anyone saying so, as the closest thing to an apology the man was built to give. The two ledgers were never combined into one. They sat, instead, on facing shelves in the valve house, the Vane numbers and the Reyes numbers, side by side, each one useless without the other, both proven only when the water came down hard enough to ask them both the same question at once. Ground remembers what falls on it far longer than any man remembers being wrong, and the two kinds of stubbornness that saved Amber Hollow had never once agreed on a method. only on the storm.